Today is our ninth speaker, Professor Randall Stewart. He taught, I have to say, he's just retired at the World Languages and Culture, a classics professor at the College of Humanities. So big shout out to the college and to this particular department. He will talk more about what it is he presents on. I think the theme is mythology and the lessons that we can learn for a more fulfilled life. So I'm excited for that. Randy was also a Go Learn professor. He was one of our lead guides for 5 trips, 2 to Sicily in 14 and 2015, and then 3 times to Greece, 2016, 17, and 18. And who knows, if we're traveling again, him and Tanya Dressler might be doing another one to Sicily for us, as that was one of our favorite destinations in 14 and 15. Randy, welcome. Hi.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction.
I'm super psyched. Again, just a shout out to all the alumni, hopefully from far away. I know we have some groupies in the room. So for those who are new to this, there's a question and answer below if you run your cursor over your screen, and there's also a chat. So you can, in fact, some people already have posted a little bit here. Here we go. Osher student from the U at Texas at El Paso. Welcome, Mark. Yes, so hopefully from far away. We're excited about that. So if you're new to this, we have a presentation for roughly 45 minutes, an hour. And then you can post your questions and we go through them chronologically and we have a conversation about mythology and about what Randy does. So I'm gonna sort of sneak out of the room and leave you to Randall Stewart. And thank you, Randall. Please feel free to add to the introduction.
Okay, thanks, Christoph. I appreciate that. No, I don't have anything to add to the introduction. I thank you all for being in attendance. I wish I could see you all. It'd be a lot more personal. If I could look out and at least see your faces out there. I can see in the chat box that some of you who've been on Go Learn trips with me have sent in some messages on the chat. So welcome to all of you, whether I have met you in the past and we're friends, or whether we have yet to meet and yet to become friends. What I'm going to do today is talk for about, 45, 50 minutes or so about a thing I call the mythological mindset. And probably the best way for me to introduce the mythological mindset is to tell you 2 stories that really are not from mythology at all, and yet they're very illustrative of the kind of thing we're going to talk about. The first of the stories was told to me by one of my students almost 25 years ago now. She was a little bit older than the traditional student. She'd spent 7 years in the Navy and was coming back to school after having finished up a stint, her 7-year stint with the Navy. She told me this great story one day after one of my mythology lectures. She said that a year or 2 before, she and her boyfriend were living in Seattle, Washington. And on a Saturday morning, they took their laundry to a local laundromat to do the laundry. And as is typical in Seattle, it was a cold, drizzly, damp, misty morning. And so they went in, did their laundry, sat there for the couple of hours while the machines did the washing, and then while they did the drying, and they folded things up, and they were on their way out. And as they were leaving the laundromat, they saw on the porch the I don't know what you call it in English, then in Greek mythology or Greek archaeological terms and Roman archaeological terms, the stoa, the portico, the front underneath the overhang was a woman who was obviously homeless, and she had taken shelter under that overhang because it had started to rain. And even though this woman wasn't panhandling, wasn't asking people coming and going from the laundromat for money, this student of mine, Kristen was her name, I can tell you her name. Kristen said that she had $5, a $5 bill that they hadn't cashed, hadn't made change out of for the laundromat. And so Kristen said she gave the woman her $5 bill. And then noticing that the woman really wasn't adequately dressed for the weather, she considered giving the woman her own sweatshirt, but she saw that her sweatshirt was very ragged and not much better than what the woman was wearing. And so she got her boyfriend to give the woman his coat. And so they gave her these items and said goodbye to her and left. And then Kristen said about six weeks later, when they were at the bottom of all the clean clothes in their drawers and had to do laundry again, they went back to the laundromat for the first time since that Saturday morning, some 6 weeks before. And as they approached the laundromat, once again on a drizzly, cold, misty, rainy Seattle day, they saw the same woman taking shelter under the overhang of the laundromat. And this time, the old woman bustled over to Kristen and, without saying anything, took Kristen's hand and opened up Kristen's fingers and placed in her palm a piece of bismuth, the element, a metallic element called bismuth, a small piece of bismuth, and then curled Kristen's fingers around the bismuth, leaned in almost conspiratorially towards Kristen and whispered, "Nothing's ordinary," and then turned and walked away without saying anything more. Nothing's ordinary. And even though this story, even this story doesn't come from mythology, it epitomizes what I think is the most important lesson of mythology, and that is that nothing is ordinary. Nothing is what it seems to be on the surface. Nothing is mundane. Nothing is run-of-the-mill. Everything is extraordinary. All right, the second story is from my own personal experience. Maybe 8 or 9 years ago, I was driving back to my home from somewhere further south in the valley. I live up in the avenues up by the Salt Lake City Cemetery. And I was coming along the east side of the Salt Lake Valley, as I so often did when I was doing something further in the southeast part of the Salt Lake Valley. So I came up I-215 and then Foothill, past the university, drove up past the University of Utah Health Complex. And then when I ran into North Campus Drive, if you know where that is, if you turn right, you're going up to the University of Utah Hospital and to the Huntsman Cancer Center. The Jewish Community Center is right across the street there. And so I turned left on, actually I'm getting ahead of myself, as I passed the whole complex of the University of Utah Medical Center up there. At one point, a youngish woman, probably upper 20s, younger 30s, probably younger 30s, younger to mid 30s, pulled in right behind me, turned right, and then pulled into the lane right behind me. And I saw in my rearview mirror that she was talking on a cell phone. And she was way too close to my rear end bumper. But I thought, maybe she just had to get her speed right after turning into the lane. And once she got her speed adjusted to the traffic, she would slow down a little bit and not be right on my tail. But no, she continued to be right on my bumper, talking on her cell phone. So I get up, as I said, to North Campus Drive, turn right to the university, turn left to go towards town. I turn left. And the woman turned left also, once again, right on my bumper. And then almost immediately, if you know that area of town, what's the road that goes through Federal Heights Drive? Is that it? I turned right on Federal Heights Drive, and she turned right on my bumper once again. There are two things that really bother me in terms of other drivers and the unkind and ungenteel things that other drivers do. One is drivers who tailgate, and the other is drivers who talk on their cell phones and are more focused on their cell phone conversations than on their driving. And so here there was, in this young woman, two of those things, those very two banes of mine in the very same person. And I could just feel my blood pressure rising. I would slow down, she would slow down, I would speed up, she would speed up. She always kept the same too short distance between her car and mine. So I got down to the bottom of that drive to where I guess it's, what is the name of that street? It's the street you turn right to go up to Shriners Hospital. If you turn left, then you're headed towards the university. So I turned right because I still do live on the north side of the Salt Lake City Cemetery. Turn right on that street, head uphill. She turns right, heads uphill, once again, right on my bumper. I turn left onto 11th Avenue, the street in the avenues that runs along the north side of the Salt Lake City Cemetery. And she's right on my bumper still talking on her phone. I was so incensed at that point that I stopped my car in the middle of the lane of traffic. I didn't even pull over to the side. There really wasn't much of a shoulder. In fact, that's why I stopped where I did. There was really no shoulder to speak of on the right-hand side of the road because there's a big hill right there. And then there was oncoming traffic. It's just a 2-lane road, 1 lane in each direction. There was oncoming traffic, so she couldn't pass me on the left. She was stuck. And I literally turned off my engine. And despite the fact that I was absolutely enraged that there was this thoughtless, careless, rude woman talking on her cell phone, riding my bumper, despite the fact I was incensed, I didn't slam my door and leap out of my car and race back to her car, closed my door, walked back to her car. I didn't shout. And she rolled down her window, which really surprised me, actually. Even at the moment, I thought, I wouldn't roll down my window if some nutcase got out of his car and was approaching me and obviously angry or upset about something. But she rolled down her window and calmly. I didn't have steam coming out of my ears. I wasn't all hot and red and flustered, despite the fact I was incensed. I said to her, for the last mile or so, you've been right on my bumper talking on yourself. And she was still on the cell phone. She kind of moved it away from her ear and she said, yes, I know, I am so sorry. I'm talking to my husband. Just a little bit ago, I got news that our 12-year-old daughter is in the emergency room at LDS Hospital, and I'm coordinating getting him there so we can take care of her. I felt like the world's biggest jerk. I didn't say a word. I should have said, I'm so sorry. But what I did was I sprinted back to my car, pulled the door open, jumped in and pulled off to the side as much as I could on the absence of a shoulder there to let her go past. I had completely misread the situation. I had seen this woman as just a thoughtless, rude, boorish woman who was not thinking about others at all. And here she was in the midst of this family drama that, and of course, I don't know the outcome of it. This story also illustrates one of the most important aspects of mythology, and that is that we are so often very poor judges of what's happening around us. And we should always think about looking below the surface to see what more there is to the situation than what we are immediately sensing and taking in. And so, having taught mythology for some 33 years, or during the course of the 30-some years, almost 33 years, I taught mythology at the University of Utah, I began to become aware that there were lessons like this in mythology, that mythological stories give us these kinds of lessons about how to live life and how to think about ourselves and our existence in the universe. And so I began to call this the mythological mindset. And I began to incorporate many lectures, portions of my lectures, to this idea of the mythological mindset, explaining what I thought it was, explaining what I thought the lessons were about how we should live our lives, and how the mythological stories teach us those lessons. This last semester, the semester that just ended officially on April 21st, there were exams, finals after that, but the last day of classes, of course, they were all online at that point. The last day of classes was Tuesday, April 21st. And I was teaching a mythology section during this most recently concluded semester. And of course, from the middle of March until the end of April, all of those classes were done online. But the students, for their final paper, which they once again submitted online, their subject matter, their topic was to write about the mythological story that had had the most impact on them during the course of the semester. excuse me. And of course, many of the students, most of them, wrote about, say, the adventures of Hercules. We call him Heracles in Greek mythology, or Jason's voyage to get the golden fleece. Maybe a story about Zeus or a story about Aphrodite. But a sizable portion of them, I would say about 10% of my class, of some 220, 250 students, I think it was, about 10% of them said that the most impactful story during the course of the semester had been the mythological mindset. And most of them acknowledged that the mythological mindset itself isn't really a mythological story. It's a set of lessons that grow out of the mythological stories. Some years ago, as I began to develop this idea of the mythological mindset, I began to present the mythological material that make up the material that makes up a mythology class. I began to present it in a way quite different from the way most people structure mythology classes when they teach such a course. Usually what you'll find in such a course is that the professor, the instructor, will kind of give an overview of the Greek deities, the Greek gods and goddesses, then talk about creation myths, and somewhere in there you get the heroic sagas about Heracles and Jason, Perseus, Theseus being the main ones, and then stories about stories that come from different regions. For example, what's called the Theban saga or the Theban cycle, the set of stories of which Oedipus is the major character. Oedipus, who was born in Thebes and then came back to Thebes, not realizing that's where he was from, and then later became king of the city, and married the widowed queen, despite the fact that she was old enough to be his mother and looked like him, and in fact, as it turned out, was his mother. So the whole Theban saga leading up to Oedipus, and then elements of the story taking place after Oedipus goes into self-exile. The whole Trojan saga, whole Trojan cycle. There's we know about the Trojan War, and when we think Trojan saga or Trojan cycle, we think about the Trojan War, but there's a whole set of stories that lead up to the actual conflict itself, and then a whole set of stories about the returns of the Greek heroes from Troy to their native lands, native towns in Greece. So the Trojan saga. And then somewhere in there, most people put in a section on miscellaneous stories that don't really fit neatly into any of those categories. Before I did a new division of the material, I also threw in not just miscellaneous stories, but also stories about love, like love stories in mythology. But as I began to develop this idea of the mythological mindset, what became clear to me was that if you looked at particular elements of larger stories and then some particular stories themselves, there was a very neat division into, I'll tell you what the sections were, and then I'll go back and explain why I divided them up like this. I did start with stories of deities because the students had to have some kind of grasp of who Zeus was and who Athena was and Aphrodite and Hermes, et cetera, et cetera. And then after the stories of deities, I talked about a unit, I did a unit on stories of birth. And of course, here is where we would do the creation story, but I would also talk about notable birth stories from Greek mythology. And then going on from there, we would do a unit on stories of early life. Usually an absence of stories about early life, as I'll delineate in a few moments here. And then the next unit was stories of deeds and journeys. And so here you get most of the heroic sagas because the heroes go on journeys. Stories of love, stories of adversity, stories of loss and death, and stories of deification, hence of afterlife. And so if you think about that, basically there's a chronological step through a person's life. And the mythological stories that pertain to each unit give us information about how to live those parts of our lives, how to view those portions of our lives, both as we ourselves are living them once we become conscious of ourselves and our surroundings, and also how to interact with people who are at other stages of those cycles in their lives, particularly younger people. in the stories of birth and stories of early life. All right, so let me give you a sample of stories from each one of those units. The first one, as I said, is stories of deities, and I won't particularly tell you any individual stories here. You can read about the Greek gods and goddesses in any handbook of mythology, or there are lots of websites, the very good websites, some of them, in fact, devoted to Greek mythology and with the stories of the gods and goddesses. What you begin to realize pretty quickly as you learn about the Greek gods and goddesses is that most of them, especially the most important ones, are personifications of various forces in nature. Weather, the sun, the sky, rain, personification of agriculture, that would be the Greek deity Demeter. Hephaestus, the personification of fire, etc. Poseidon, personification of the sea. And the reason the Greeks created these deities as personifications of these forces of nature is because they needed some way to have some influence on those forces of nature. If you were a farmer in ancient Greece, as such a high percentage of the population was, you were reliant on the sun, on rain, on the soil for your livelihood, your ability to live and sustain yourself and your family. You were utterly dependent on those forces of nature. Well, you can't very well pray to the ground. You're not going to get any kind of response from the inanimate ground. You're not going to get a response from the sun, from the clouds when you need rain. You're not going to get a response from the sea when you have to take your goods to some nearby island for trade. And so you personify those elements of nature and those forces of nature because you can pray to Zeus, personification of the sky. You can pray to Poseidon, the personification of the sea, to Demeter, the personification of soil and agriculture. You can build temples to them. You can make sacrifices to them, and you can do things to get them on your side so they are more likely to give you what you need. One result of this, by the way, is that the Greek deities, if you know anything about them, are certainly not role models. They were never set up to be role models. And this idea of how they came into existence as creations of elements of nature that human beings needed to try to have some control over shows why they didn't need to be role models. And so it's often surprising to us, those of us familiar with modern Western religions, that the Greek deities can be such scandalous characters and such terrible role models. Well, they weren't designed to be role models. Basically, the unit I do on deities is to give the students a cast of characters for the stories that come next. Let's move on then to the next unit, which is stories of birth. And what you find when you look at birth stories, either a story that's that's only about the birth of some character in mythology, or that's an element of some larger story involving that individual, what you almost always discover, especially in the case of heroes, is that a birth in mythology is almost always either divine or miraculous, and often a combination of those two. For example, the heroes are all descended from the gods, from Zeus. Theseus, there's some question about the parentage of Theseus, but it's generally believed that even though his earthly father was a mortal man named Aegeus, after whom the Aegean Sea is named, symbolically his father is Poseidon. So he also then would be a son of a god. And so to have a god as your father, or as your mother, is usually your father in Greek mythology, is certainly a divine birth. Let's talk briefly about the story of the birth of Perseus. Perseus is the Greek hero who went on to behead Medusa. Perseus' grandfather, a man named Acrisius, didn't have any sons. He did have a daughter, but he wanted a son because kings back in those days would hand their kingdoms down to sons, not to daughters. And so he goes to the oracle at Delphi and he says, "Will I have a son?" And the oracle says, your daughter will have a son, and your grandson, your daughter's son, will grow up to kill you. Well, Perseus doesn't want to have a grandson who's going to kill him, and he doesn't want to kill his own daughter. That wouldn't be right. So he simply locks her in a bronze tower. If she's in a bronze tower, she can't meet up with any man. She can't conceive. She's not going to have a son who will grow up to kill her grandfather, his grandfather. Well, he has to leave air holes in the in this bronze tower, else his daughter Danae would suffocate. And so he does create these air holes. Zeus looks through, talk about a scandalous deity. Zeus sees Danae through some of these air hole cracks in the bronze tower, and he comes down to her in the form of rain and gold coins, according to some versions of the myth, and impregnates Danae. So 9 months later, or whatever the gestation period would be for a Greek god and a mortal Greek woman, she gives birth to Perseus. So this is a divine and a miraculous birth. Divine in that the father is Zeus, the king of gods and men, and miraculous in that he was able to meet up. Mingle is the word we use if you've been in my mythology class, or if you've been on one of my study abroad or go learn trips and have participated in our mythological happy hours, of which I have very fond memories. You know that mingle is the euphemism we use. And so it was certainly miraculous in the way that Zeus mingled with Danae and became the father of Perseus. So here we have a divine, miraculous birth. And I could talk about the births of each one of the major Greek heroes and of many other characters in Greek mythology, and you would see that this kind of divine and or miraculous birth is a hallmark of these stories of birth. And I think the lesson for us in our lives is that birth is miraculous. And anything that's really miraculous that we truly don't understand, we can call divine, almost regardless of how we conceive of divinity. And I think the point is that we are to see our own existence in the world, our coming into existence, as something divine and miraculous, something that science to this day can't completely understand, although we certainly know much more scientifically about the whole conception and birth process than did the ancient Greeks. Nonetheless, there are still mysteries there. And so we move on then to stories of early life. And as I alluded to before, stories of early life are practically non-existent. You look at the heroic sagas of those major Greek heroes, and maybe you have one or two stories about what that hero does for the first 25, 30 years of his life. There's just this huge gap in the record. And I think this is very significant. I think what we're to learn from this is that there's a time of our development when we are to be out of the public eye, regardless of what it is we're destined to do, regardless of what great accomplishments we're going to achieve later in life. There's a time when we grow, when we develop, and this is a time when we are out of the public eye. We are moving along at our own pace, at our own speed. We're not necessarily doing anything significant. We're not expected to be doing anything significant or important other than learning how to be a true human being, learning culture, learning civilization, learning all of the abilities that we will need to function as an adult in the world. And I know in today's world, there's a real tendency to push kids to get them on the fast track in whatever the subject matter is in school, whatever the talent is that we hope they'll acquire, the ability to play the piano or play soccer or any other sport, or become a whiz at math. And I think mythology suggests to us that even if we do provide our children or grandkids with every opportunity to progress and to move ahead, I think mythology says this is a time when we shouldn't be putting them out in front of the world. We shouldn't be requiring or expecting our kids to make a big splash and to be noticed by others around them very much. This is a time for them to slowly develop, to mature, to come of age. All right. And so then we move on to the period of life when we're adults, when in our mythological characters are adults, having gone through this period of development. And so we move on next to stories of deeds and journeys. One of the things that it became very clear to me over the years that I taught mythology is that the Greek heroes, despite the fact that each one of them does as his major, and I say his because all the ancient Greek heroes are males, other than his main task, each one of the, and sometimes even for his main task, but each one of the Greek heroes does an enormous amount of good for the people around him. Good things that the people around him can't do for themselves. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. The Greek hero Theseus, of course, is mainly known for going to the island of Crete while still a relatively young man and killing the Minotaur, which itself was a service to human beings, and certainly to other Athenians, because the Athenians were under obligation to send 14 of their young people at regular intervals, and mythological tales vary on how often how long the interval was. But nonetheless, 14 Athenian young people at these various intervals were required to be sailed to Crete and to be put into the labyrinth, the giant maze that housed the Minotaur, the half man, half beast, the half bull that lived in the maze. And because the Minotaur needed human flesh to survive. And so when Theseus kills the Minotaur, in fact, he's doing a service for generations of Athenians after that. But even before he goes to Crete to kill the Minotaur, he travels from the city in which he was born, a little town called Troezen, in the northeast corner, as it were, of the lower part of Greece, the Peloponnese or the Peloponnesus. He travels from Troezen to the city of Athens. His mother, he was raised by a single mother, and his mother never told him who his father was, the king of Athens, Aegeus, by arrangement with Aegeus. But Aegeus had told her that when Theseus was old enough, he should be sent to Athens. He should travel to Athens to find his father, without any idea who his father was. And Theseus then, instead of going by sea, which would take only a couple of hours, half a day at most, goes by land, which takes many, many days. It's a long distance to walk. I've driven it in a car before, and it's almost a whole day in a car, mostly because the roads are narrow and windy. But to walk it would take days and days. Along the way, Theseus had 6 adventures, and each one of the adventures, because that's what he wanted. He could have gone by sea, but he would have been there and he wouldn't have experienced very much on the way. He wanted to have adventures. He wanted to have a chance to prove himself as a hero, and that's why he went by land. And he does have 6 adventures. We won't talk about all of them, but in each one of them, he gets rid of some horrible monster or some horrible evil person who was making life miserable for others, often killing other people. And in each case, Theseus meets up with the character, be it an animal or a human being, and does that person in, hence making the world a better place for other people, serving other people. I mean, I'll just talk about one of those that's one of my favorites. There was a guy named, in some accounts, he's called Sinis, S-I-N-I-S. Oh, and spelling counts on the test. It's a multiple choice test, but spelling counts. Sinis, S-I-N-I-S, or a little bit longer, I wouldn't give you this one on the test, Pitiocamptes, which means pine bender, because this guy, Sinis, or Pitiocamptes, would capture people, passers-by, travelers who were going through the area where he lived, and he would hold them captive, and then he would take the tops of 2 huge pine trees and bend them down, because he was a giant, monstrous person. He would bend the tops of these pine trees down, and he would tie the hands of his victim to one of the pine trees, and the feet of his victim to the other pine tree, and then he would let the two pine trees go, which of course would split the person in half. Theseus does precisely that to Sinus Pityocamptes, hence making the world safer for other travelers who would be passing by that area. Excuse me. And each one of the 6 adventures he has is of that nature. It becomes really clear as you look at those 6 stories, if you look at the stories of other Greek heroes and what they did, that one of the main things heroes do is they serve other people. They do kind acts for other people, and they accomplish for other people good things that those people can't accomplish for themselves. Another thing that heroes do is they go on voyages, they go on journeys. Jason, for example, I mentioned before that Jason goes to the far side of the Black Sea to get the golden fleece. And this is emblematic of the heroic journey. The journey always involves going at least to the edge of the known world, but usually going beyond the bounds of the known world, going beyond the mapped territory, going places where no one has gone before, at least no Greeks. And once again, this is symbolic. What this teaches us is that to live our lives fully, to become complete people, we need to go on a journey. We need to extend our boundaries. We need to push into areas that we haven't gone before, areas where we don't have a roadmap, where we don't have GPS, where we have to find our way along, where we're out of our comfort zone. And the hero is always reborn as a part of his journey. And very often the journey involves going to the underworld. This is something that every Greek hero does. Every Greek hero, usually literally in Greek mythology, but sometimes figuratively, makes a journey to the underworld, to the land of the dead, while still alive, and then returns still alive. And of course, this is a representation of death and rebirth. It's figurative. The hero doesn't literally die. But the message for us is that at some point in our lives, we need to doff what we were wearing before, figuratively wearing. We need to kill off who we were before, and we need to be reborn as a new individual who knows more, who's more experienced, who's been on the journey. And the journey is never about the destination. It's never about the golden fleece at the end, or the cattle of Geryon beyond the known world and near what's now called the Strait of Gibraltar that Heracles went on. It's really never about the destination. It's about what you learn about yourself and about the world, but primarily about yourself as you're undergoing this journey. And once again, the message for us is that we need to experience in our lives this kind of metaphorical death and rebirth as someone new, with a new way of looking at the world, with new knowledge, with a new way of approaching the world and those around us. Usually life presents us with such an opportunity, and we don't have to create one for ourselves. But it is in fact possible for a person to create her own journey in life, her own metaphorical death and rebirth. For some people, this is going on some kind of a trip, not a go-learn trip where everything's taken care of for you and the amenities are fantastic and it's going to be the best trip you ever went on in your life because everything's taken care of for you. But where you go out and rough it, you go to a place where you don't know the language and you don't have a translator, you don't have a guide, you don't know how to rent a car, you don't know how to get your cell phone to work in that other country. For some young people, it can be joining the military. For members of various religions, it can be going on, say, an LDS mission or some kind of humanitarian service. to some part of the world where you're on your own, where you're out of your comfort zone. And so we can create these kinds of opportunities for ourselves at various points in our lives, even if the natural course of our lives doesn't lead us in that direction. Okay, the next section that I do in my mythology classes then is stories of love. And what became very apparent to me almost immediately when I started thinking about love stories as discrete units is that Greek love stories are tragic. They almost never end happily. You know, we love that expression in American folklore that we're so familiar with as kids, and they lived happily ever after. You almost never hear that expression in any kind of account of Greek mythological characters who fall in love and take up life together. It's almost always tragic. Let me give you a couple of examples. One of my favorite Greek love stories involves a woman named Hero. We might think that Hero would be the male's name, and Leander, the other one, would be the name of the female. But actually, in the ancient Greek language, Hero can be a feminine noun, a female name, and Leander can be a masculine noun, a male's name. Hero and Leander live on opposite sides of that narrow neck of water that flows from the northeast part of the Aegean Sea into the Black Sea. It's nowadays called the Dardanelles, I believe. The Hellespont is what the Greeks called it. And they lived on opposite sides of this channel, the Hellespont. And every night after he finished his job, his day job, probably a kind of muck job kind of thing, the male, Leander, would jump into the Hellespont and swim across the channel to spend the rest of the night, once he arrived on the other shore, to spend the rest of the night with his lover, Hero. And she, every night, would hold a lantern in a tower, and Leander then would be able to follow the light of the lantern to get across the channel, to find his way. So he would swim the shortest possible distance and tire himself as little as necessary to make the arduous swim across the channel. And then in the morning he's got to go back to his job, but by then it's light, and so he can find his own way back across because he can see. One of these nights, as Leander is in the water, just barely entered the water to swim across the Hellespont, a terrible storm emerges. Wind, thunder, rain, very heavy rain, and Hero cannot keep the lantern lit. It keeps going out. The wind and the rain keep extinguishing the flame of her lantern. And without that light to guide him, Leander meanders, so to speak, can't find his way. He swims too far north, he swims too far south, sometimes probably even swam away from the opposite shore completely, having lost his direction completely. And he never arrives on the other shore. When it's light, when the storm has abated, Hero comes down from the tower, rushes down to the shore, and sees the corpse of her lover, Leander, washed up on the shore. Without her light to guide him, he is drowned. A tragic, absolutely tragic ending. And the Greek mythological love stories are all like that. One or the other of the members of the couple will die in some tragic way. And that's the end of the relationship. By the way, I'm going to come back to one of the lessons in this in just a moment. But the story about Hero and Leander, I think, is one of the most amazing stories in mythology. And if you remember that idea of nothing's ordinary, nothing is what it appears to be on the surface, you can apply those dicta to this particular story. Sure, it's a tragic story about a woman who can't keep the light going for her husband, her lover, and her lover drowns. But if you look below the surface, and you don't have to look too deeply to get this part of the story, what's going on with the light is that Hero, the female character, is the light. She's the salvation of Leander. when she cannot be there with the light, he's completely lost and he perishes. I submit to you that Hero is one of the most laudable, praiseworthy female characters in Greek mythology, which generally gives very short shrift to women and is quite misogynistic in nature. This story is certainly quite the opposite. But I think the message in Greek love stories for us is that love can be tragic. It can be very painful. Any of you who have been married for a long, long time know how difficult it is to be in a relationship and to make a relationship work. It's very, very hard work with moments of great pain and sorrow. And unfortunately, it usually happens that one of the people in a relationship will pass away before the other one does. And regardless of how good the relationship was, and in fact, regardless of what the views are of the afterlife that each member of the couple has, there's a tragedy in losing someone to whom you were so close and with whom you spent so much time. And I think the Greeks were very much aware of that kind of tragic aspect of love. But the message comes through very powerfully in these love stories that despite its pain, despite its agonies, despite its potential tragedy, love is worth it. The benefits of having a loving companion, of being in a loving relationship, far outweigh the disadvantages, far outweigh the risks. There's a whole school of thought amongst stodgy classicists. I am a classicist, but I don't consider myself a stodgy classicist. There's this large group of classicists going back for a century or two, this large group that believes there's no such thing as romantic love in ancient Greece and Rome. I think all you have to do is look at these ancient Greek mythological love stories to see that there was indeed romantic love, and it was thought very highly of despite its shortfalls and risks and, as I said, potential tragedy. All right, let's move on then to the next unit, which is stories of adversity. And it's in this unit that I tell the story of Oedipus. There's a certain kind of adversity there, Oedipus fighting against his own fate. Actually, prior to Oedipus fighting against his own fate, his father fighting against his fate. But it's also in this unit that I do the whole story of Troy, the whole Trojan saga, ending, of course, with the story about Odysseus and his 10-year voyage home from the Trojan War. Excuse me. Let me talk about one aspect of that long, arduous journey that Odysseus had to get home from the Trojan War. He fought at Troy for 10 years, mythology tells us, and then his voyage home also lasted 10 years. But a lot of people don't realize, unless they've read the Odyssey very carefully, is that Odysseus spends 7 of those 10 years as a prisoner on the island of a goddess, Calypso. And you might say, a prisoner of a goddess on an island? This goddess takes care of him. She feeds him, and in fact, just nature feeds her. She doesn't have to do any work. Odysseus doesn't have to do any work. There are no tasks to perform. He doesn't get sick or ill any of the time he's with her. And Calypso absolutely head over heels falls in love with Odysseus. And she begs him to opt to stay on the island with her forever. She will make him a god. He will never have to work. He will never get older. He will never get sick. He will never die. He'll be able to sleep with her, this beautiful goddess, every night, and she will never get older. She will never get sick. Or he can return to Penelope. Penelope, who's now 20 years older, his wife on the island of Ithaca, where he was from. Penelope, who's now 20 years older and has probably gained some weight and turned gray and is starting to get saggy and who gets sick from time to time and who sooner or later will die. And on Ithaca, he'll have to farm, he'll have to ranch, he'll have to take care of himself and his household and all of his people. He's king of the island of Ithaca. Stay with me, Calypso says. Stay here in paradise. And so Odysseus has this choice. he can opt for paradise, for the perfect world, the perfect existence, no ills, no woes, no troubles ever. Or he can go back to the real world, pain, sickness, woes, challenges, eventually death. What does Odysseus choose? Well, of course, he chooses to go home to the real world. This is an extremely powerful message for us that we are to live in the real world and not try to live in some kind of fantasy world. Most of us never have the option of that kind of a choice of moving into a perfectly carefree existence. Well, we all have our own little fantasies. We all have our own little fantasy worlds that we can go into and do go into from time to time where we're not living in reality, where we try to push away obligations and problems and woes and ills. But the message of this myth, as is the message of all these stories of adversity, is that we are to embrace the difficulties in life. It's the difficulties in life and the very fact that we're going to die at some point, about which I'll talk more in just a moment. It's those very facts that make our lives meaningful and that give our lives purpose. If we could live on the island of Calypso with no woes, no troubles, no ills forever, we would cease to exist in any meaningful way. And Odysseus knew that. And we should embrace that kind of idea in our own lives. It's no fun to have things go wrong. It's no fun to be living through a pandemic and not to be able to go anywhere. By the way, I would have returned just last week from 2 months in Greece were it not for the pandemic. And I'll get there as soon as it's safe to do so. But in the fantasy world, you don't have to live through pandemics. You don't have to have earthquakes. Major earthquakes occur just as the pandemic is getting going and everything's shutting down. You don't have the woes and the trials and the tribulations. And these things aren't pleasant. We shouldn't wish for them, but we should appreciate them, I think. And I think that's the lesson of mythology. We should learn that and this is one of the things we learn from the heroic sagas, from going on our journeys, we learn that we can make it through difficult times. We do have the capacity as human beings, and the heroes are really just representative of us, of human beings. We do have the capacity to accomplish the difficult things in our lives and to make it through difficult times. And we're to choose that kind of a life and not try to escape from it. All right, let's move on to stories of loss and death. The major point, there are two major points here in the Greek mythological stories about death. The first point is that if we look at the deaths of the major Greek heroes, each one of them dies in some almost insignificant way. You would think that a great hero who had gone to kill the Minotaur and had defeated all these other monsters and beasts would die in some confronting some enormous beast or a combination of beasts or something like that. Or that Heracles, who was able to accomplish so much in doing his 12 labors and the associated side labors, would have some kind of significant end in some kind of great battle where he was just completely overcome and no one could possibly have survived it. But each one of the Greek heroes dies in some kind of seemingly insignificant, tragic way. Jason, for example, who goes with his Argonauts on this fantastic voyage, overcoming all kinds of obstacles to get the golden fleece and then to come back with that fleece to Greece. Jason, as an old man, is lying on the beach one day in the shadow of his boat, the Argo, on which he had gone to get the golden fleece and had returned. And the Argo, like Jason himself, is now old and falling apart. It's propped up on stilts, as it were, on the beach. And as Jason is lying in the shade underneath the Argo, part of one of the aged timbers of the Argo comes loose, breaks loose, and falls on Jason and kills him. That's a very ironic, insignificant way to die. Certainly ironic for a great hero to die because of his boat on which he had accomplished his major task in life was falling apart. let me talk about that one aspect of stories of loss and death before I go on to the other one. I think what this teaches us is that death can come regardless of how healthy we are, regardless of what things we've done in our lives, regardless of how accomplished we are. Death can come in unusual, unexpected ways, in unexpected times. We just never know. And I think the message in that is that makes living each and every moment, each day of our lives to the fullest, as important as could possibly be, because we don't know when what we're doing now is the last thing we'll ever do. The other thing we find in the stories of Greek mythological heroes is that, and some other mythological characters, is that very often they become gods, either figuratively or metaphorically, symbolically, after their deaths. And I think here the message for us is that Perseus, for example, Perseus, who beheaded Medusa, is made into a constellation. So he's up there in the sky. The ancient Greeks believed that the stars were celestial divine beings. And so it's a metaphorical, symbolic deification. But I think the message for us is that we should live our lives as true heroes, doing good for other people. And if we do that, once we are gone, we will continue to be a guide, as it were, for those who live on after us and who have the memories of us and the good things that we did. In a sense, it's a metaphorical deification that we continue to be spiritual guides for people after we die because of the good things we did on earth. And so those, for me, those are really the most basic parts of the mythological mindset. The mythological mindset consists of looking very deeply at everything around you, always looking below the surface, always bearing in mind that nothing is ordinary, and always remembering that our lives are finite and we could be gone at any moment. And as a result of that, we should be living our lives as completely and as fully as possible, being as kind as we can possibly be to those around us, doing good as much as we possibly can, and always remembering that what we think we are seeing may not be the real situation. There may be something just below the surface that we can see and appreciate and learn from if we just dig a little more deeply. That's what I have to present about the mythological mindset. I'm actually writing a book about this, and some days I write a lot, and then 2 or 3 days in a row I don't write at all, so I can't predict when the book will be out. But I hope to have that out at some point and be able to say a little bit more about the mythological mindset that I have than I've said right here. So I guess I can take questions, comments.
Well, first, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I took some notes, in fact. I loved how it ended too. A little bit contrary to a true mythical story where everything is tragic and everything is doomsday. I think your ending was, your spin was just perfect. A lot of this really goes close to my heart because that's what we kind of try to achieve with Go Learn as well, to be just a different kind of traveler, to always consider it an absolute treasure that we can leave. And I think in this pandemic is where we realize, wow, we can't leave. And hopefully we return to travel again, and we take all this good stuff and never take it for granted ever again, right? So thanks for all of this. Nothing is ordinary. That was my first note, and I kept going through it. So thank you so much, Randall. We are getting to some questions. The gentleman from the Osher in Texas had to leave a little early, but I wanted to give a little shout out to what is Osher? What is the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute? That is students of 50 years and better. And in fact, it's endowments nationwide. The Osher family has given millions upon millions of dollars to universities like ours to create a learning environment for those who are 50 and better. And I think that goes back to all the mythology again. Never stop learning, never stop taking things for granted. Just because you're getting a little older doesn't mean you shouldn't go to school. So thanks to the Osher family out there, if they were ever listening to what we have to say. But all right, let me get to some of the questions here. I'm starting with a little bit with the chat first. Um, there is, okay. Samar asks, what are some stories or perspectives that we can use to give today's seemingly mindless destruction and tumult meaning?
Yeah, I can see that question in the chat window. It's a very good question, and I think a brief way to answer that would be by referring by bringing up again that story of Odysseus faced with the choice of living in the real world or living in fantasy, and the message from that we should embrace difficulties and problems. Ideally, we don't get them all at once, as we seem to be getting right now, but. But I think mythology gives us hope. It should give us hope that we can overcome the difficulties and the challenges that we face, that the world faces. We can do our part to make the world better, at least for those in our immediate surrounding. And I don't think we should ever underestimate the importance of a simple good deed. You know, we talk about paying it forward and the ripple effect, and I believe very strongly in that. You do a kindness for someone else in the morning, and that person is much more likely to do a kindness for someone else in the afternoon, and then that person kindness for someone else in the evening. And I think by virtue of that kind of ripple effect, paying it forward, I think we can do an enormous amount of good in a world that's very troubled and tumultuous, especially right now.
I agree, and I almost want to say too, if you happen to do something good, whether it's really small or something even bigger, just the feeling it gives to you, that alone is already you know, rewarding in itself. And I think your self-worth increases just if you do a kind of an act of kindness will always lift your own spirits. So.
Good point.
Jan made a comment. Thank you. I hope I'm the teacher to my children and grandchildren as such. Elaine, thanks. Randy, fantastic as always. Antonio, I would like to join Professor Randall in the next trip to Greece. Are you planning on a Go Learn trip to Greece?
Yeah,
I don't see anything on your website.
Christoph, I can tell you that Tony and his wife were HV60 students in my mythology class this last spring. And regularly, I would say probably once a week as I was entering or leaving the classroom, they would ask me, are you going to do another Go Learn trip to Greece? We really want to go on another Go Learn trip to Greece. And I would very much like to do another Go Learn trip to Greece once it's safe to do so.
Fantastic. I'll take you up on that.
Okay.
All right, I'll switch over to questions and answers. Here's a good one. How many myths continue on within modern religion? That is, you know, for instance, like worshiping the sun.
Oh, there are a lot of ways in which aspects of ancient Greek myth, and I'm thinking about Greek myth in particular, but this would apply to other mythologies also. Excuse me. There are various ways in which aspects of these myths continue on in modern religions. For example, I talked about some of the things that heroes do. And in my mythology class, I actually have a few more things that weren't quite, that some of which aren't quite as germane to the mythological mindset as the ones I mentioned. But I have a series of 8 aspects of a Greek hero's life. And virtually all of the heroes have most, if not all of those 8 aspects in their life. That gap in the divine miraculous birth is one of them. An early threat to life, we didn't talk about that, but some possibility that they're going to be done in when they're still infants. And then that gap in the public record that we talked about in the stories of early life, et cetera, main journey, trip to the underworld, deification. Every one of those 8 elements is present in the story of Jesus in the New Testament, originally Greek, translated, of course, into many other languages since then. And so that would be one example. Jesus Christ himself is very much and if you're a devout believer, don't take offense at this, because I don't mean it in any kind of demeaning or offensive kind of way. But Jesus is very much a mythological character, which is a good thing. I don't think that diminishes for people who believe in him literally. I don't think that diminishes his importance at all. So that would be one example. The whole idea of the need to die and to be reborn figuratively. Many religions, especially Christianity, practices the rite of baptism, and baptism is a ritualized death. You're put down, usually below water, sometimes symbolically being sprinkled with water. But the idea is you're put to death, and then you are resurrected as you're brought back up out of the water, a new and different person. And that's right out of ancient Greek myth, this idea of the journey to the underworld. So those would be two examples.
Yeah. And I mean, we talked a lot about classical mythology in terms of like time span, Greek mythology specifically today. But I think deep down, I think myths, whether Celtic or pagan, pre-Christian, they're all kind of speaking to the core of humanities.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what it is. It's finding yourself, doubting yourself, all these things. Hollywood has adopted a lot of these things. Let's see, we have one more. Thank you. You got me out of my house and I think he means, this is Tim writing. I'm heading out of my house. You gave me a lot to think about. My question is this: considering how all these stories come from different sources and times, how is there such unity in them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the entire books have been written about that, and there are entire schools of psychological thought. For example, C.C. Jung, the one-time student of Sigmund Freud, went off into his own direction, his own area of psychoanalysis and spiritual thought. C.C. Jung wrote a lot about the similarities between myths from different parts of the world and even different time periods, where there could certainly have been no borrowing, no literal borrowing, no contact between the peoples who came up with one mythology and the peoples who came up with another mythology in another part of the world later or earlier, that have so many similarities. And he ascribed it to what he called the collective unconscious, and the idea of these archetypes that are constructs in the human mind. I don't know, for me, the jury's still out on that. I can't say I'm Jungian in any kind of way, and yet I think there's a lot of value in so much of what he said and wrote. But I do believe that we as humans, regardless of where we live or when we live, regardless of the culture in which we grow up, we have certain similarities, certain ways of looking at ourselves and looking at the world that are more or less universal. And as a result, we come up with the same kinds of stories to represent, to communicate that way of looking at ourselves and the world. And that's really all mythology is. Mythology, regardless of the time period it comes from or the people who developed the specific mythological stories, mythology is never anything more, giving it that kind of introduction sounds like I'm belittling it, but when it comes right down to it, maybe this is a better way to put it, it's simply a way of communicating things that cannot be communicated in any other way. Things about who we are, things about the world and our existence in the world. And so it makes sense that mythologies would be very similar from one culture to another, from one time period to another.
We are having another guest speaker coming up in this series, Karin Baumgartner. She will talk about fairy tales, and a lot of this is of course the lesson learned in these stories, and how much it really is a tool of moral compass. And so the same here. I find it very fascinating. Jan is writing. Antonio is having another question. where can I read about the Bible stories based on Greek mythology? For instance, Jonah's story.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there are books on that topic, books that compare biblical stories with mythological stories. Um, but I'm a little embarrassed to say I don't know of any. I myself, having been born and raised in a very Christian household and reading the Bible often regularly. When I started studying mythology, I was able to make lots of connections between the mythological stories that I was learning and the biblical stories I had learned as a child. And the story about Jonah, who's swallowed by the whale, which is a figurative death, and then he's thrown up by the whale 3 days later, a figurative rebirth. Um, there must be books about that, but I don't know of any titles.
We'll look it up.
Okay.
So I think there are many comments as thank you, and people have had to leave the room, but the majority is still here. But still, I think we're coming to an end. If there's no more other question, I wanted to thank you, Randy, for taking your time out of your busy retirement. Not to belittle that, because I know for a fact, once you retire, you get more busy than you've ever been.
I haven't found that to be true,
unfortunately.
No?
Oh.
Fortunately.
I thought, all the travel and everything, but unfortunately we can't today. So we brought the road, so to speak, to you at home. So thank you for joining us far and near. Thank you for all your, Randy, for the wonderful presentation once again. And
thank you, Jeff.
Hopefully soon at some point we will travel again, and then we'll maybe we can put Greece and or Sicily back on our programming.
I hope so.
Okay. Thanks everyone out there.
Yes, thank you for your participation, questions, attendance.